Terracotta Army hidden underground. In the autumn of 1974, a group of workers drilling a water well outside the city of Xi'an in China's Shanxi province struck something hard at a depth of about 4 meters. They pulled up shards of fired clay, then a human ear, then a hand, then a face staring up at them from the dirt, still wearing the expression it was given 22 centuries ago. What lay beneath them was not a well. It was an army. For decades, historians had assumed that the tomb of China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, who died in 210 BC, was a sealed mound. Impressive, yes, but simple in its ambition. The classical texts mentioned an elaborate burial complex, but texts lie or exaggerate or go silent when they matter most. The comfortable story was that the emperor had built himself a monument, as emperors do, and that it lay quietly beneath the soil, modest and alone. The blind spot was geological. The tomb complex sits beneath a landscape that has been farmed for 2,000 years. No one expected anything to survive at that depth in that soil. No one was looking. The village of Yanzai had grown up beside the mound without curiosity, because curiosity is a luxury of people who are not hungry. The discovery unfolded slowly, then overwhelmingly. Archaeologist Zhao Kangmin was among the first to excavate formally, beginning in 1974. What emerged was not a few statues. It was a full garrison. Pit 1 alone holds roughly 6,000 soldiers in battle formation, each with individually rendered facial features, each once carrying a real bronze weapon. Subsequent pits revealed cavalry, archers, officers, and horses. Some estimates now suggest 8,000 figures in total, arranged in strict military order, positioned to guard the emperor's mausoleum in perpetuity. The implications reach in several directions at once. The engineering feat alone defies easy comprehension. An industrial-scale undertaking of clay, pigment, and bronze, carried out under the supervision of a state that had only recently unified a fractured continent. But the deeper meaning lies in the theology beneath the craft. These soldiers were not symbolic. They were intended to function. The emperor genuinely believed, or compelled others to believe, that the army would continue its service in whatever realm came after death. The afterlife was bureaucratic. It required logistics. It required a standing army. The main burial chamber has never been opened. The ancient texts describe rivers of mercury flowing through miniature landscapes, mechanical crossbows rigged to fire at intruders, a ceiling set with pearls representing the stars. Modern soil surveys confirm elevated mercury levels in the mound. It waits. The world simply stopped looking down. Dead Sea Scrolls discovery. In the winter of 1946, a young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Ed-Dib was searching for a lost goat near the cliffs of Qumran on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. He threw a stone into a cave to startle the animal. Instead of the sound of hooves, he heard pottery breaking. Inside the cave, wrapped in linen and sealed in clay jars, were leather scrolls, some of the oldest biblical manuscripts ever found. They had been sitting there for roughly 2,000 years. The textbook story said that the Hebrew scriptures as we knew them were essentially stable, that the texts handed down through medieval copying were reliable transmissions of ancient originals. The chain of custody seemed unbroken. The established view held that the Jewish canon was fixed and coherent, and that the distance between ancient originals and modern translations was a matter of scribal precision rather than editorial evolution. The problem was that no one had seen the originals. Medieval manuscripts are medieval. The oldest complete Hebrew Bible known before 1947, dated to the 10th century AD, that left a gap of 1,000 years or more between the texts being copied and the events they described. In that silence, scholars had to trust a tradition they could not verify. What Muhammad Ed-Dib found, and what archaeologists from the École Biblique and later the Israel Antiquities Authority would excavate over the following decade, were scrolls dating from the 3rd century BC to the 1st century AD. Among them were copies of almost every book of the Hebrew Bible, including a complete scroll of Isaiah more than 7 meters long. Scholars such as John Trevor photographed the documents in 1948. The interpretation battle began almost immediately and has never fully ended. Some of the scrolls match the medieval texts with extraordinary precision, confirming centuries of careful copying. Others diverged in ways that matter. Words were different. Passages were arranged differently. Entire sections read as variations rather than copies. The canon, it turned out, was not fixed. It was still being argued over in the 1st century BC. The editors who shaped what we now call the Bible were working on a manuscript tradition that was still fluid. What a person believes to be the eternal word turns out to be a document that was still being edited. That is not a scandal. It is simply the nature of things written down by human hands in uncertain times for an audience they could not quite imagine. The Rosetta Stone Decipherment. In July 1799, a French soldier named Pierre-François Bouchard was supervising the demolition of an old wall near the Egyptian port town of Rashid, known to the French as Rosette, and to history as Rosetta. His shovel struck a flat black stone. It was granodiorite. It was covered in writing. 3 scripts ran in parallel columns down its face. Ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics at the top, a simplified Egyptian script called Demotic in the middle, and ancient Greek at the bottom. It was a priestly decree. It was issued in 196 BC, and it was the key to a language that no living person could read. For more than 1,000 years, hieroglyphics had been a closed system. The last inscription in the ancient script dated to around 394 AD. After that, the knowledge of how to read it simply died, absorbed into political collapse, religious upheaval, and the gradual extinction of the priestly classes who had maintained the tradition. European scholars who encountered hieroglyphic texts in the centuries that followed could admire their visual complexity but could not penetrate their meaning. The established view held that they were symbolic rather than phonetic, a picture language, each image standing for a concept. The problem was that this assumption was wrong, and assumptions that are wrong but comfortable tend to persist. It took nearly 14 centuries for someone to challenge it properly. The Rosetta Stone passed into British custody after Napoleon's defeat in Egypt, and was installed in the British Museum in 1802. The race to decode it was genuinely competitive. The English polymath Thomas Young made early progress, identifying a cartouche, an oval frame, as enclosing a royal name and correctly working out several phonetic values. But it was the French linguist Jean-François Champollion who cracked the full system, announced in a letter to the Académie des Inscriptions on September 27, 1822. Champollion understood that hieroglyphics worked both phonetically and symbolically at the same time, a hybrid system of extraordinary sophistication. What followed was the unlocking of 3,000 years of Egyptian text. Temple walls, papyrus scrolls, administrative records, love poetry, medical treatises, mythological cosmologies, all of it suddenly readable. A civilization that had spoken to us in silence for 14 centuries began to speak. The Egyptians never stopped writing. We simply forgot how to listen. Sutton Hoo Ship Burial. In the late spring of 1939, an amateur archaeologist named Basil Brown was working in a waterlogged field at Sutton Hoo in Suffolk, England. He was employed by Edith Pretty, who owned the land and was curious about the grassy mounds rising from the heath. Brown began probing the largest mound with a trowel. 3 meters in, he struck a corroded iron rivet, then another, then the ghost of a ship. For most of the 19th century, the Anglo-Saxon period in English history had been regarded as a kind of cultural dark age. The rough, unglamorous interlude between Roman Britain and the Norman conquest. The established view held that the peoples who inhabited Britain between roughly 400 and 1000 AD were competent farmers and fierce warriors, but not particularly sophisticated in their art, their trade networks, or their ritual life. Germanic tribes doing their best in difficult circumstances. The problem was that almost no one had looked hard. Anglo-Saxon burial practice often favoured cremation. Organic materials rot. Graves had been plundered for centuries. The written record was fragmentary. The silence of the archaeological evidence was mistaken for the silence of the culture itself. What Brown uncovered at Sutton Hoo in 1939 was a ship burial of staggering complexity. The vessel itself, roughly 27 meters long, had decomposed entirely, leaving only a shadow in the soil. The stain of its planks, the pattern of its rivets, the outline of its form pressed into the earth like a memory. Inside the burial chamber at the center of the ship lay an astonishing assemblage of objects. A helmet of iron and tinned bronze, its face mask now one of the most recognizable images in British archaeology. Gold and garnet jewelry of breathtaking refinement, a ceremonial sword, Byzantine silver, a lyre, drinking horns, a purse of 40 gold coins. The identity of the person buried here remains uncertain. Many scholars believe it was Raedwald, king of the East Angles, who died around 625 AD. The burial itself betrays a mind caught between two worlds. Pagan in its ship funeral tradition, but surrounded by objects that speak of long-distance trade, of Christian neighbours, of a court culture that stretched from East Anglia to Constantinople. The Anglo-Saxons, it turned out, were cosmopolitan. The Dark Age was not dark. It was simply unlit, for lack of looking. Lascaux cave paintings. On a September afternoon in 1940, 4 teenage boys from the village of Montignac in the Dordogne region of southern France followed their dog into a hole in the ground. The dog had found the hole a few days earlier. The boys widened it with a knife, lowered themselves into a cave chamber, and raised their oil lamp. The walls of the cave were covered in animals. The accepted understanding of prehistoric art at the time held that Paleolithic cave paintings were relatively rare, broadly similar in style, and likely the product of a single extended cultural tradition traceable back perhaps 20,000 years. The cave at Altamira in Spain, discovered in the 1870s, was the benchmark. Spectacular but singular. The assumption was that such art represented a late flourishing of prehistoric creativity. The problem was that the assumption was built on too thin a sample. Very few caves had been investigated systematically. The French countryside hid hundreds of karst cavities, and most of them had never been entered, never been mapped, never been considered as potential archives of human creativity. What the boys found at Lascaux, and what archaeologist Henri Bruy confirmed when he arrived days later, was a gallery of nearly 2,000 images rendered with extraordinary technical confidence. Horses, aurochs, deer, ibex, bears, a rhinoceros, a wounded bison with a disemboweled man beneath it. The animals move, they overlap. They are painted in ochre and manganese dioxide using brushes, blowpipes and fingers, exploiting the natural contours of the cave wall to give the figures depth and volume. One hall has been called the Hall of the Bulls. The largest bull is 5 meters long. Radiocarbon dating places most of the Lascaux paintings between 17,000 and 15,000 years ago. The people who made them were fully modern humans living through the last ice age. They were not primitive. They were skilled observers of the natural world, technical innovators, and artists with a developed sense of composition. Whatever need drove people into these dark chambers to paint, ritual, record, prayer, story, it was deep and persistent. The cave was not a home. It was a destination. Chauvet Cave, art older than expected. In December 1994, 3 cave explorers, Jean-Marie Chauvet, Eliette Brunel, and Christian Hilaire, were working their way along a cliff face in the Ardèche Gorge in southern France, when they felt a faint current of air rising from a blocked fissure. They dug it out. They squeezed through. They found themselves in a cavern system of cathedral dimensions, and on its walls were hundreds of animals, painted with a precision and confidence that seemed impossible. The art at Chauvet, now the Chauvet Pont d'Arc Cave, was familiar in its subject matter. Horses, woolly rhinoceroses, cave bears, mammoths, lions drawn mid-movement, nostrils flared, ears back, caught in the act of being alive. But it was not familiar in its age. When radiocarbon dating results came back in the mid-1990s, they showed that some panels at Chauvet were painted around 36,000 years ago. That was roughly twice the age of Lascaux. The established view held that cave art evolved gradually, that early paintings were simple, schematic, and tentative, and that sophistication developed over millennia through a kind of aesthetic trial and error. The comfortable story was one of progress, crude to refined, simple to complex. The problem was that Chauvet demolished that story on first contact. The art there is not primitive. The rhinoceroses are drawn with shading. The lions are arranged in perspective, overlapping in ways that imply spatial awareness. A technique called stump drawing, smearing pigment to create gradient and texture, appears on panels dated to 36,000 years ago, deployed with what can only be called mastery. Archaeologist Jean Clotz, one of the first to study the site systematically, described the experience of entering Chauvet as stepping into a place where time had been inverted. The artists responsible for the earliest paintings were not groping towards a technique they had not yet discovered. They already had it. And then, for reasons we cannot reconstruct, it was lost and found again thousands of years later at other sites. The implication is not comfortable. Artistic sophistication did not evolve in a single line from crude to refined. It appeared, disappeared, and reappeared across time. human creativity is not a ratchet, it is a tide. The tomb of Richard III, found beneath a parking lot. On a grey morning in August 2012, a team from the University of Leicester began excavating a city centre car park in Leicester, England. They were searching for the lost priory of the Grey Friars, where a medieval chronicle recorded that the body of King Richard III had been buried after his death at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. The car park sat on the approximate footprint of the old priory. Within 2 days, they found a skeleton. The textbook story of Richard III had been shaped almost entirely by Tudor propaganda. He was the villain of a succession crisis, the murderer of his nephews in the Tower, a man whose body, according to the chroniclers who worked for the dynasty that killed him, was physically deformed as a reflection of his moral corruption. The hunchback, the withered arm, the crooked soul. For 5 centuries, this portrait had been maintained with the conviction of people who have never needed to produce a body. The problem was exactly that. The body had been lost. The Grey Friars Priory was dissolved under Henry VIII in the 1530s, its buildings demolished, its records scattered, its graves disturbed. Where Richard lay became uncertain and then forgotten. Without a body, the Tudor narrative could never be tested. It stood unchallenged for 500 years. The skeleton found in the car park in 2012 was analysed by a team led by osteologist Joe Appleby. The results were methodical and precise. The bones showed severe adolescent onset scoliosis, a real spinal curvature, though nothing like the monstrous deformity described by Tudor sources. The skeleton showed wounds consistent with a battlefield death. A bladed weapon had struck the base of the skull with enough force to shear away a portion of the cranium. There were other wounds, including what appeared to be post-mortem humiliation injuries, strikes made after death, consistent with a body stripped and displayed. DNA analysis, comparing the remains to 2 living descendants of Richard's sister, confirmed the identification with near certainty. It was him. The scoliosis is real, but mild. The rest, the withered arm, the grotesque appearance, the limp, is fiction, built by victors who needed their enemy to be a monster. What the car park revealed was not just a king's bones, but the mechanics of historical character assassination. A body misshapen by a childhood spinal condition was transformed by hostile narrators into evidence of a corrupt soul. And for 500 years, the story held because the body was gone. The bones beneath the tarmac waited quietly for someone to ask. Machu Picchu rediscovered. In July 1911, a Yale historian named Hiram Bingham III was being led by a local farmer named Melchor Arteaga along a steep ridge in the Peruvian Andes, several hours from the city of Cusco. Arteaga had told him there were ruins above. Bingham was skeptical. He climbed anyway, through thick cloud forest and along ledges above a 1,000-meter drop to the Urubamba River, until he emerged into a clearing and found himself standing among buildings of white granite, so precisely fitted that no blade of grass grew between their stones. The accepted understanding was that the Inca civilization, though impressive in its engineering and administrative reach, had been fully mapped by Spanish colonial records. The conquistadors had catalogued what they found. If something major existed, they would have noted it. For a century after Spanish conquest, European administrators had surveyed, taxed, and converted the Andean highlands. The assumption was that the known sites were the significant sites. The problem was that the Spanish had been focused on accessible centers of power. Cusco, Cajamarca, the roads between them, the high ridges, the cloud forest, the paths known only to local farmers and their ancestors. These were invisible to the colonial map. Not hidden deliberately, but simply outside the gaze of people with no reason to look. What Bingham found at Machu Picchu, and what he photographed obsessively and published widely, was a royal estate of the Inca emperor Pachacuti, built in the mid-15th century and abandoned, or at least emptied, within a century of its construction. The site covers roughly 5 square kilometers of terraced agriculture, temples, palaces, and astronomical observation points. Approximately 500 people may have lived there at any given time. A retreat, not a city, though it contained everything a city requires. Bingham called it the lost city of the Incas, a phrase that was inaccurate but magnificent. The local Quechua-speaking communities had never lost it. It was the outside world that had not been told. The Inca built without iron tools, without the wheel, without mortar. And what they built is still standing. The Uluburun Bronze Age shipwreck. In the autumn of 1982, a Turkish sponge diver named Mehmed Çaka was working the seafloor of Uluburun Point near the town of Kaş on Turkey's southern coast, when he noticed a row of unusual shapes on the bottom. Copper ingots, a lot of them. He reported the find to the local museum, and in 1984, a systematic excavation began under the direction of George Bass and Semal Pulak of the Institute of Nautical Archaeology. What they found over the next decade of underwater excavation, 11 field seasons, more than 20,000 dives, was a merchant ship that had gone down around 1300 BC in the late Bronze Age, carrying a cargo of such diversity and richness that it changed everything scholars thought they understood about international trade in the ancient Mediterranean. The established view held that Bronze Age commerce was largely local, that the exchange of goods between the civilizations of Egypt, the Levant, Cyprus, the Aegean and Anatolia was episodic, opportunistic, and small in scale. The comfortable story was of isolated polities trading cautiously across suspicious distances. The world of Homer was the first globally connected Mediterranean. Before that, silence. The Uluburun ship demolished that story in every detail. The cargo included 10 tons of copper ingots from Cyprus, 1 ton of tin ingots from sources in Afghanistan, ebony logs from sub-Saharan Africa, hippopotamus ivory and elephant tusks, glass ingots of cobalt blue, turquoise, and lavender, Canaanite jars filled with terebinth resin, pomegranates, and olives. Egyptian jewelry, including a golden scarab bearing the name of Queen Nefertiti, a set of balance weights conforming to at least 5 different measurement standards from different Mediterranean civilizations, a diptych of boxwood writing boards, the world's oldest known folding book, Cypriot pottery, Mycenaean pottery, tin bronze swords of Aegean, Italian, and Levantine design. The ship was a floating node in a trading network that stretched from sub-Saharan Africa to Afghanistan. It carried the material culture of at least 8 different civilizations simultaneously. The Bronze Age world of 1300 BC was not isolated. It was as interconnected, as commercially sophisticated, as reliant on long-distance supply chains as any era since. The ship sank, and we forgot. The sea remembered. The Phaistos Disc mystery. On a July morning in 1908, The Italian archaeologist Luigi Pernier was excavating the Minoan palace of Phaistos on the island of Crete when a worker's trowel struck a circular object in a side room. Pernier lifted it carefully. It was a fired clay disc, 16 centimeters in diameter, covered on both sides with tiny stamped symbols arranged in a spiral. The symbols were unlike anything in the known Minoan script. There were 241 of them, composed from 45 distinct signs. The disc was dated to roughly 1700 BC. For more than a century, scholars and enthusiasts have attempted to decode it. None have succeeded, or none have succeeded in a way that others accept. Proposals have included everything from a prayer to a harvest record to an astronomical calendar to a board game. The symbols resist every approach. They may represent a syllabic script, a logographic system, or something entirely outside the categories modern linguists expect. The language underneath may be Minoan, Anatolian, or something with no known relative. The disc may be a local product or an import. It may be unique or the surviving fragment of a tradition. The problem with the Phaistos disc is not lack of interest, it is lack of context. There are no other documents in the same script. There is no bilingual parallel. There is no Rosetta Stone for Phaistos. Without additional texts to cross-reference, the disc cannot be cracked by logic alone, no matter how sophisticated the analysis. What the disc represents, beyond its specific content, which may never be known, is a reminder that the ancient world was more linguistically diverse than we have recovered. For every script that has been deciphered, there are others that have not. The writing systems of the Indus Valley, the Rongorongo of Easter Island, Proto-Elamite, Linear A. Behind each one lies a civilization with its own administrative needs, its own theology, its own way of marking the world with signs. The Phaistos disc sits in the Heraclean Archaeological Museum in Crete. It has been studied by every tool available to modern scholarship. It has not yielded. Some things keep their silence. The Vinland Map Controversy. For a long time, the map looked authoritative. The Vinland Map, a parchment chart depicting what appeared to be the coast of North America, labelled in Latin with the name Vinland Insula, surfaced in 1957, bound with a medieval manuscript and attributed to a 15th century cartographer. If genuine, it would be the earliest known cartographic representation of the Americas, predating Columbus by decades and confirming the Norse voyages to North America described in the Icelandic sagas. Yale University acquired it in 1965 and announced it to the world. The established view of pre-Columbian contact between Europe and the Americas had been cautious. The Norse sagas describing Leif Erikson's voyages to Vinland were known and broadly believed, but direct physical or documentary evidence had never been produced. The comfortable story of Columbus as the European discoverer of the New World rested partly on this evidentiary silence. The problem was the ink. Analytical chemist Walter Macrone, examining the map in 1972, found titanium dioxide in a crystalline form called anatase, which was not commercially produced until the 20th century. The conclusion seemed clear. The map was a forgery. For decades, the Yale map was widely dismissed. The sagas were real. The map was not. But the story did not end there. Subsequent analyses using different methods produced conflicting results. A 2002 study by Robin Clark using Raman spectroscopy found that the titanium was consistent with natural sources present in medieval inks. Later, radiocarbon dating placed the parchment itself in the 15th century. The debate continued, with different research teams reaching incompatible conclusions about whether the map is genuine, partially genuine, or a sophisticated forgery on authentic medieval material. The Vinland Map Controversy is instructive for reasons beyond the map itself. It is a case study in how much scientific conclusions depend on the tools available and the questions being asked. Evidence is not self-interpreting. The same object, examined by competent scholars using rigorous methods, can produce diametrically opposed readings. Certainty in archaeology and in life is rarer than we prefer to admit. The Norse did reach North America. The site at Lons-aux-Meadows in Newfoundland, excavated from 1960 by Norwegian archaeologist Helge Ingstad and his wife Anne Stein Ingstad, confirmed it beyond argument. The map, real or forged, was never the point. The Nazca Lines, visible only from above. Seen from ground level, the Nazca Lines of southern Peru are almost invisible. They are drawings scratched into the surface of the Nazca Plateau by removing a thin layer of reddish-brown iron oxide-coated pebbles to reveal the pale yellowish-grey earth beneath. They cover an area of roughly 50 square kilometers. From the ground, you see straight lines disappearing into the distance. From the air, you see a spider, a hummingbird, a condor, a monkey with a curled tail, a human figure with enormous eyes. The lines were created by the Nazca people between roughly 500 BC and 500 AD. The established view for most of the 20th century was that they must have had some function comprehensible from ground level, perhaps marking underground water sources, or tracing paths for ritual processions. The idea that the figures were primarily intended to be seen from above was treated, in more serious archaeological circles, as a problem, because from the ground they cannot be seen as figures at all. They are meaningful only at altitude. The problem was one of intent, and intent is invisible in the archaeological record. Anthropologist Paul Kosok first recognized their aerial dimension in 1939, when he happened to fly over the plateau. German mathematician Maria Reich spent decades mapping and measuring the lines from the 1940s onward, identifying their precision and scale. But the question of why spend generations constructing imagery that the makers could never fully perceive, has no clean answer. The most durable explanation involves the relationship between the Nazca people and the sky. The Andes cosmologies of this period were deeply attentive to mountains, weather, the movement of celestial bodies, and the figures that ancient skywatchers saw in star patterns. The geoglyphs may have been offerings, images made for the gods or the spirits of the landscape, who looked down from above. The making of the image, not its viewing, may have been the point. That possibility is stranger and more moving than any of the fringe explanations. A people who spent centuries creating beauty they could never fully see, not for tourists, not for themselves as audience, but as an act of devotion directed upward at something they could not reach. The Baigong Pipes Mystery. In 2002, a survey team working in the Qinghai province of northwestern China reported the discovery of unusual structures near Mount Baigong. 3 triangular-shaped caves in a cliff face. Irregular iron oxide pipes running through the cave walls and into the ground. Similar pipe-like formations emerging from the shore of a nearby lake. The structures appeared, at first glance, to be old, possibly very old. Some popular accounts suggested they were evidence of prehistoric industrial activity or something stranger. The established view of ancient China's technological history placed its most sophisticated metallurgy in the Bronze Age, roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. Pipe making, as a deliberate engineering exercise, was associated with far later periods. No known prehistoric culture in the region was credited with the kind of industrial capacity that planned pipe infrastructure would require. The problem was assuming the pipes were man-made at all. When scientists from the Beijing Institute of Geology examined samples in 2002, they found something more interesting than fabrication. The pipes were formed through a natural geological process. Tree roots had been buried in sediment during an ancient flood event. Over thousands of years, the organic material decomposed and was gradually replaced by iron-rich minerals that had permeated the surrounding rock. What remained were iron oxide casts of ancient root systems, natural pseudomorphs, nature's imitation of engineering. The implications are significant in a different way than the fringe accounts suggest. What the Baigong pipes reveal is not ancient industry. They reveal how efficiently the human mind, encountering the unfamiliar, reaches for the explanation that involves human agency. Unusual shapes in rock that look intentional are assumed to be intentional, because intentionality is how we habitually interpret the world. We see design in what is random and manufacture in what is geological, because those are the categories we carry. The pipes are nature's work, but the leap to fabrication is also nature's work, the nature of a mind that cannot stop looking for makers. The Baghdad Battery Debate. In 1936, a German archaeologist named Wilhelm König was working in the basement storage room of the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad, when he noticed a peculiar object in a collection of items excavated near the village of Kujutrabu, southeast of the capital. It was a clay jar, about 14 centimeters tall, containing a copper cylinder capped with asphalt, through which an iron rod had been inserted. König dated the vessel to the Parthian period, roughly 250 BC to 224 AD. He recognized what it resembled: a galvanic cell, a battery. The established view of electrical knowledge held that the deliberate production and use of electrical current began in the modern era, with Alessandro Volta's invention of the electrochemical cell in 1800 and the slow industrialization of electrical technology that followed. Ancient peoples understood certain static electrical phenomena. They did not, in any mainstream account, produce controlled direct current. The problem with Koenig's identification, and with the subsequent tests that showed the jar, when filled with an acidic liquid, such as vinegar or grape juice, could produce a small voltage of around half a volt, is the absence of context. If these jars were batteries, what were they powering? No wires have been found, no circuit, no device that required electrical current. No text from the Parthian period describes anything resembling electrochemical processes. The jars may have been used for electroplating, coating objects with thin layers of metal. But that application, while plausible, has not been demonstrated archaeologically. The most cautious interpretation is that the Baghdad battery is a clay storage vessel whose contents and function remain unknown, and whose resemblance to a galvanic cell is either coincidental or imperfectly understood. The most expansive interpretation is that someone in the ancient Middle East discovered, accidentally or deliberately, that certain metal combinations in acidic solutions produce electrical current, and found some use for it that has left no trace. Both interpretations are defensible. The object exists. What it means is still a matter of honest disagreement among people who have handled it and thought carefully about it. That is a rarer state of affairs than it sounds. Uncertainty, honestly held, is its own form of knowledge. The Voynich Manuscript. It sits in the Beinecker Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University. 240 pages of vellum, written in an unknown script, illustrated with drawings of plants that do not match any known species, astronomical diagrams of uncertain meaning, bathing women in interconnected pools, and elaborate cosmological charts. The Voynich Manuscript takes its name from Wilfrid Voynich, the Polish antiquarian who purchased it in 1912 from a Jesuit college near Rome. Radiocarbon dating places the vellum's creation between 1404 and 1438. The writing has never been decoded. The textbook story of medieval manuscripts is one of accumulation. Copies of classical texts, theological commentary, medical herbals with recognizable plants, astronomical treatises grounded in Ptolemy. Medieval knowledge, for all its gaps, was largely continuous with what came before and what came after. Documents that survived were, on the whole, intelligible. The comfortable assumption was that any surviving manuscript from this period would eventually yield to paleographic analysis. The problem with the Voynich manuscript is structural. It has statistical properties consistent with natural language. It appears to follow Zipf's law, which describes the frequency distribution of words in real communication systems. It has long and short words, recurring sequences, internal rhythms. It behaves like writing, but every attempt to map it onto any known language or cipher system has failed. Cryptographers from both world wars examined it. Computational linguists have applied modern algorithms. Stephen Bax, a linguistics professor, claimed partial decipherment in 2014, but the academic consensus has not accepted his readings. Theories range from the plausible to the eccentric. It may be a lost natural language written in an invented script. It may be a constructed philosophical language, of which several were invented in the medieval and early modern period. It may be an elaborate hoax, a book of nonsense designed to look meaningful, created to be sold to a credulous buyer. Carbon dating rules out nothing except very early and very late dates. What the Voynich manuscript offers, aside from the puzzle itself, is a meditation on the limits of pattern recognition. The human mind is exquisitely sensitive to structure. It finds faces in clouds, narratives in random events, meaning in noise. The manuscript may be exploiting that sensitivity, a sequence of patterns that fire recognition without delivering content. Or it may be waiting for the right key, the right mind, the right comparative text that has not yet been found. The book has been studied for more than a century. It has not spoken, but it has not stopped looking like it might. The Copper Scroll Treasure List. Not far from the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the same cave complex at Qumran, a copper scroll was found in 1952. Unlike the leather and papyrus manuscripts that surrounded it, this one was written on thin sheets of pure copper, riveted together, and it had to be cut into strips with a circular saw before it could be read. What it said, when deciphered in 1956 by John Allegro and others, was a list. Specifically, a list of 64 locations where enormous quantities of gold and silver had been buried. For decades, historians accepted the Dead Sea Scrolls as a religious archive, the library of a Jewish sect, probably the Essenes, who had fled to the desert and hidden their texts before the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The copper scroll was assumed to be part of the same deposit. Its contents, however, do not resemble those of the other scrolls. There is no theology, no commentary, no prophecy, just coordinates and quantities. The problem is the quantities themselves. If taken at face value, the copper scroll describes a treasure totaling somewhere between 35 and 65 tons of gold and silver. That figure exceeds the known annual revenue of the entire Roman province of Judea. It far exceeds what any known Jewish institution in the 1st century possessed. The numbers seem impossible, which is exactly why scholars have argued for 70 years about what they mean. Some believe the treasure is real, perhaps the wealth of the Jerusalem temple hidden before the Roman siege, recorded on a medium that would survive indefinitely. Some believe it is mythological, a summary of legendary treasure traditions with no physical referent. Some argue the scroll was a practical document for a community that possessed real wealth, albeit far smaller than the figures suggest. No systematic excavation of the listed sites has found anything. The copper scroll is serious in its medium and absurd in its contents. Someone went to the extraordinary trouble of engraving coordinates on metal that would last thousands of years. Whatever they were recording, they believed it mattered. Whether it was wealth, myth, or something in between, the scroll speaks of a moment of desperation, a community that feared losing something and tried to ensure it could be found again. The finder has not yet come. The terrible beauty of Tollund Man. In May 1950, 2 peat cutters, working in a bog near Tollund in central Jutland, Denmark, were digging with their long-handled spades when they uncovered a face. It was so perfectly preserved that they stopped work and telephoned the police. They believed they had found a recent murder victim. The face wore an expression of absolute peace. The eyes were closed. The mouth was slightly open. He wore a pointed skin cap, fastened under the chin, and a smooth leather belt around his waist. He was naked apart from these. He was approximately 40 years old. He had been placed in the bog around 400 BC. The established view of European Iron Age peoples, the pre-Roman Celtic and Germanic tribes of northern and central Europe, was shaped largely by classical sources, which described them as fierce, ritually conservative, and not particularly introspective about death. Burial practices were known mainly from cremation and inhumation graves. The bogs were thought to be liminal spaces, certainly, but their role in human death was understood only vaguely. The problem was that bogs are not merely wet ground. The peat bog environment is strongly acidic, anoxic, and antimicrobial. Under the right conditions, it preserves organic matter indefinitely. Skin, hair, fingernails, internal organs, stomach contents, the expression on a dead face. The bodies that had been recovered from northern European bogs since the 17th century were individually catalogued, but not systematically understood. They were curiosities, not a pattern. What the Tollund Man revealed, and what P.V. Glob's 1969 book, The Bog People, brought to scholarly and public attention, was that Iron Age bog bodies share certain characteristics that point to ritual rather than accident. Tollund Man had been hanged with a braided leather rope still around his neck. His last meal, preserved in his stomach, was a carefully prepared gruel of barley, flax, and numerous wild seeds. He had been placed at the bog with deliberate care. On his side, in a fetal position, with his cap adjusted and his hands arranged. The forensic evidence suggests human sacrifice. The ritual care suggests reverence. The two things are not contradictory. A death that is an offering is also a death that is attended to. The Tollund Man was killed, and he was mourned, and he was placed in the cold, dark water, as gently as a child being put to bed. The bog kept him for 24 centuries. His face is still one of the most human things in any museum in the world. The lost city of Petra. The caravan city of Petra was known to Europeans through classical texts. Diodorus Siculus, Pliny the Elder, and others described a great trading metropolis in the southern Jordanian desert, capital of the Nabatean kingdom, carved from rose-red sandstone. Arab geographers of the medieval period referred to it. But by the early 19th century, no European explorer had confirmed its location, and the Nabatean civilization had passed from knowledge into legend. In August 1812, a Swiss explorer named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, travelling in disguise as a Muslim pilgrim under the name Ibrahim ibn Abdullah, persuaded a local guide to take him to a site venerated as the Tomb of Aaron, deep in a canyon system east of Wadi Musa. He was taken through the Sikh, a narrow, winding gorge barely wide enough for two people to walk abreast, and emerged into a valley where the facades of monumental tombs and temples had been cut directly into the cliffs. The most famous, the one that now graces every travel poster, appeared directly ahead. The treasury, Al-Khazneh, its colonnaded front rising 28 meters from the canyon floor, perfectly preserved in the dry desert air. The Nabateans who built Petra were Arab traders who had carved a civilization from a landscape that seemed to offer nothing. They controlled the incense route, the ancient trade network linking the frankincense and myrrh producers of Arabia and the Horn of Africa with the consumers of the Mediterranean world. At their peak, in the 1st century BC and AD, Petra may have housed 30,000 people in a city with a sophisticated water management system. Channels, cisterns, dams, and pipes that made the desert bloom. The established view of Arabia before the rise of Islam had been one of relative emptiness. Nomadic tribes, sparse settlements, no urban tradition of significance. Petra demolished that story. The Nabateans were architects, engineers, artists, and merchants of the first order. Their script became the direct ancestor of Arabic. Their trade networks stretched from the Red Sea to Rome. Burckhardt could not linger. He was travelling in disguise in dangerous territory, and his guide grew suspicious. He sketched what he could, recorded the name, and left. He told a colleague what he had seen before dying of dysentery in Cairo in 1817. He was 32 years old. He never went back. The rose-red city had waited for him. It kept waiting. The Cave of Altamira. In November 1879, a young girl named Maria de Sautuola was exploring a cave on her father's estate in Cantabria, in northern Spain, while her father, Marcelino Sanz de Sautuola, examined the floor for artifacts. Maria looked up. The ceiling above her was covered in bison, life-sized, painted in red, black, and ochre, moving, each one, in the posture of an animal alive or dying. She called to her father. The established view of prehistoric humans at the time held that Paleolithic people, the cave-dwelling hunter-gatherers of the Ice Age, were intellectually closer to animals than to modern humans. They used tools, made fire, and survived. But art, in the full sense, planned, deliberate, aesthetically intentional image-making, was thought to be a product of civilized minds. It required a cognitive sophistication that the scholars of the 1870s were reluctant to grant to people who lived before agriculture, before writing, before cities. The problem was that this belief was a form of prejudice given an archaeological name. When Marcelino de Sautuola published his findings in 1880, attributing the Altamira paintings to the Paleolithic, the reaction of the scholarly establishment was almost unanimous rejection. The art was too good. It could not be old. The most prominent prehistorian in Europe, Emil Cartaillac, declared it a forgery. De Sautuola died in 1888, his reputation damaged, his discovery unaccepted. In 1902, 14 years after de Sautuola's death, Cartaillac published an essay he called Mea culpa d'un sceptique, My fault, said a skeptic. New discoveries at other French caves had made Altamira's authenticity undeniable. The paintings were real. They were old. Cartaillac admitted he had been wrong. It remains one of the most honest retractions in the history of science. The Altamira bison are now known to be among the finest animal paintings ever made, by any human in any period. The shading, the foreshortening, the use of natural rock contours to give the body's dimension. These are the techniques of a trained eye and a confident hand. The people who made them were fully modern in every cognitive sense that matters. De Sautuola's daughter looked up and saw something true. It took the rest of the world 20 years to look in the same direction.